So the trip to Australia was very awesome. Had an amazing time, loved every second of it. And being immersed in a totally different culture really opens up your eyes to uh, a lot of the different social norms, especially for the sports culture. So one thing kind of noting was that we must kind of realize that being in a different nation, the sports culture really is only different to us. So I noticed that when we were there, a lot of people um, in our group kind of noticed that the sports were, this is very strange, or this is really weird. Um, and that's really just because that's just not what we're used to. And that's kind of one thing to note is that, um, if they were to come over to our sports culture, the way we do things would be very strange to them. Um, and so then hearing them say, "Oh, the way you guys do things are strange," can come off as offensive. So that's kind of one thing that I learned in the very beginning about this whole sports experience. So I've never been a foreigner. This was my first time out of the country, actually. Um, as well, every sporting event I've ever attended was a sport I always really understood. Um, so going to my first Australian rules football game was really a new experience for me, very different. So in the beginning, it seemed like just a bunch of guys kicking around football, hitting each other. Wasn't even really sure what the goal of the game was. And as the game, eventually went on, I started to pick up, a little bit of rules here and there, and eventually got the hang of it. But I kind of would find myself cheering and yelling kind of whenever the crowd did, and that was just actually an attempt to kind of assimilate myself and just kind of be a part of the atmosphere and be a part of the crowd. And it was funny because you could actually start to see people kind of look over at you, and I think they could pick up on my accent and kind of the fact that I really wasn't, not where I was supposed to be, but kind of that I was out of my place. But one thing that this experience did make me come to realize is that sport is a lot like language, really. No matter where you go in the world, it exists. However, it just exists in different forms. So let's take a look at what the Australian sports culture is mostly comprised of. In the U.S., it's football, basketball, baseball, and hockey would be considered the big four in sports. In Australia, if we want to look at their four main sports, it would be AFL, which is Australian rules football, cricket, soccer, and rugby, of which there are actually two different variations of rugby, rugby league and rugby union. And it's actually interesting to note that there are two different versions of the same game, and within these two different versions, there are actually really only very minor differences in kind of the tackling and in the scrum. Otherwise, they're the same with scoring and kicking and everything like that is actually all the same. So it's interesting to note that there are these two minor differences, but there's actually a preference for one over the other. So another thing I learned about that's really big in the Australian sports culture is the State of Origins game. Now, what the State of Origins game is a rugby league tournament, essentially, that takes place only between two of the states in Australia, Queensland and New South Wales. So players in the Professional Rugby League, which is the NRL, well, only for this, I think it lasts about a week or so, and I think it's about 3 or 4 games. Whatever state you're born in is the state you play for. So it doesn't matter where a professional player plays in Australia, during the State of Origins, he will play for his home team. So this is an interesting concept that I think will actually make its way to the States eventually. We can get the best football players or the best baseball or basketball players from like a state like New York or from like a state like Florida or Texas, and they could just have really these interstate games and essentially kind of try to represent the state that they're from. And I think it's an interesting concept that the future of sports could hold here in the U.S. It was also interesting to learn about the MLB game that was hosted in Australia. It took place at the Sydney Cricket Grounds. So the circular cricket field was altered into a baseball diamond, and the Los Angeles Dodgers and the Arizona Diamondbacks played their opening games there in the 2015 season. So I think that this holds really interesting implications for future international sport because this relationship that has now been built between the MLB and Australia, in which we could end up hosting perhaps a future cricket game at a baseball stadium, kind of like how at some professional football stadiums they host, international soccer games and things like that. Perhaps they could even host a rugby game. But it's just this building of a relationship between the two countries that holds, very curious implications for future sport.
So I want to take a little bit of time and talk about my first professional sporting experience in Australia. Our first pro game that we went to was an Australian rules football game. It was featured Sydney versus Hawthorn, which to my understanding is a pretty big rivalry, so a large crowd was expected. And so as we're walking up to the stadium, the sport manager in me is really coming out. I'm looking for things that they're doing differently from the U.S. sports culture. Now, while it does heavily resemble the American sports culture, with the exception of the games that they play, as I was walking around, I noticed, they had all the stands where you could purchase team merchandise. They had their sponsored tent. They had a BMW tent where you could try and sign up to win a free car. But one thing I did notice that was a little bit interesting, that I've never really noticed in U.S. sports culture, was a live band outside, playing during pregame, for the fans to kind of enjoy and rally around and perhaps get them pumped up for the game. It was kind of a rock band, it seemed like. Now, upon entering the stadium, I'm looking for things like sponsorship placements. What are they giving away, if anything? They had these little cardboard fans that would fold up, and then if you were to pull it apart, it said Swans score. And so anytime, this Sydney Swans would score, you would hold it up and wave it around. And during the game, they a lot of their sponsorship placements are the same. They have it kind of along the bottom of the sections. They have it on the scoreboard, and all through the stadium, much like a U.S. sports team would. The one different one that I did notice was that after the teams would huddle up on the field after the first and third quarters, they would hold up a banner, a big banner behind the teams. And that just had a sponsor on it. Just an interesting little place to hold a sponsor. It'd be like if during like a media timeout at a Xavier basketball game, and the team huddles up on the court, we would get a big banner and essentially hold it around the team huddle, not necessarily to block anything from being seen, just another place to draw the eye to a sponsor, during the in-game experience. And then during halftime, they featured a bunch of youth teams that played on the field. Their little AFL games that they would play. Kind of like we've done that here in the States. We've done that at Xavier even during soccer games. And then after the game, an interesting thing to note was that as we were going towards the buses, we noticed large crowds heading in that direction, and we kind of thought to ourselves, "There's no way this many people are going to use the bus." But in fact, that's what it was. I would say about 50 to 60% of the fans that were there actually used the public transportation system. They had about, I want to say 10 to 12 buses that were cycling back and forth that would, drop people off and then come back to pick more people up, which is just a very interesting concept, the wide use of public transportation there, because what that, implies for the revenue generated through the parking fees and things like that. But then again, the stadium ops does not have to hire all these people to help work that. So while at the same time it's sort of saving them that money, they're also losing some revenue from the number of people that would be paying parking fees. Because we know here in the U.S. We can charge a pretty penny for prime parking. Another thing to note was that they actually didn't have a guy walking up and down the aisles selling beer or selling food or anything like that. You had to get everything from the concession stands downstairs, which is just kind of an interesting concept that I actually think reflects the Australian culture, which they are very, very conservative with the alcohol they serve. They have a strict policy never to overserve anybody in any establishment, whether it be a bar or a professional sports game. Now, I want to take a little bit of time to talk about the difference in the collegiate sports cultures of Australia and the United States, because the professional sports cultures hold a lot of similarities. However, the collegiate sports are vastly different. So, in the U.S., collegiate sports are looked at as a gateway to professional sports arena. Highly talented athletes, Division I scholarships are athletic scholarships are highly coveted, and every kid dreams of playing in college and then going pro. In Australia, that's not the case. No kid really desires to go play college sports as much as they do here, and that's just because college sports in Australia are just not necessarily gateways to the professional arena. They're actually just kind of looked at maybe as club sports would be looked at here. And in Australia, they have some very skilled collegiate athletes. However, that's not really a gateway into the professional sports realm. And that's just because they don't have the resources that, say, like, a Division I, like Texas football might have, where they have coaches and dietitians and strength coaches, for every position that there is. And, they probably have, 6 facilities dedicated solely to Texas football, whereas in Australia, when we visited the University of Melbourne, which is considered the top university in Australia, they only had 5 athletics facilities in total. They had a field hockey pitch, an AFL pitch, a weight room dedicated solely to their collegiate athletes that was actually smaller, I would say, than O'Connor Sports' weight room. They had a swimming pool, and then they also had, I believe, an off-site rowing facility. And those are the facilities dedicated to their collegiate sports. I actually also believe that they might have had a track and field facility. But clearly they don't have the resources that we have here. Their athletes don't even get full ride scholarships. I believe that they said the most an athlete will receive is $5,000 a year, and that can actually even just be used for whatever they want. It can be used for tuition, it can be used for housing, and things like that. So college athletics are really not pursued heavily by young athletes in Australia, and that's just because it's not really a gateway to the professional sports realm like it is here in the States. A lot of the kids, if you want to go pro, they'll play for these under 18 travel teams and these minor league teams and things like that. That's not to say that people from college don't go pro. However, it is extremely rare. Whereas here in the United States, it's almost a prerequisite for almost every sport to attend college, and then you are able to go pro. And again, that just has to do with the resources that colleges have to offer here in the States as compared to the resources that are scarcely available in Australia.